For many videographers, green screen is a technique that's so close and yet so far. I mean, on one hand, how cool is it that you can put anything you want in the background? Put yourself in space, or in the middle of the desert, or just make yourself a part of your presentation. But when you try to pull it off yourself, well, that's a different story. The edge always looks terrible, it looks fake, and no matter how many times you fiddle with it, you can never get it right, and you know your audience is never going to forgive something that looks this bad, and you're just about ready to tear down the whole stupid green screen and just forget the whole thing. But don't give up just yet. With a few adjustments to your workflow, green screen might not be as hopeless as you think. The first thing you'll want is lots of soft, evenly spaced light. You want the brightest light you can find. You know those big, bright, cheap fluorescent softboxes you bought a while ago but you never used because you got tired of bumping into them and they're kind of a pain to set up? Now's the time to bring them out. The more light you have, the less your camera will have to compensate. When the camera artificially makes the picture brighter, it usually results in a lot of noise. And then, once your camera takes that picture and compresses it into a video file, that noise turns into blocky smudge. That blocky smudge is your keyer's worst enemy. You need to have the cleanest signal you can get, and the easiest way to do that is with lots of light. And it needs to be as even as possible. In other words, it needs to look like this, not like this. If you try to work with this shot, you may never get the keyer settings right. The easiest way to make sure your lighting is even is to use a waveform monitor. But you don't need dedicated hardware. Pretty much every non-linear editor nowadays has a waveform monitor. Get a sample shot of the screen all by itself. Then switch to waveform monitor view. It should show up as a fairly consistent line from one side to the other. You don't want a big, obvious slope. This will tell you how even the light is from left to right. But what about from top to bottom? Flip your sample image by 90 degrees, and then look at the waveform monitor again. Another thing that'll leave you stranded in post-production hell is if you leave your camera on auto exposure and auto white balance. If the camera keeps changing, the keyer will have no idea what green is, unless you add about 500,000 keyframes in post. So find some way to lock down the exposure settings on your camera. Put it in manual and dial in the settings by hand. Or at the very least, find out how to lock the auto exposure and white balance. We recommend that you put it in manual and write down the settings so that you can dial in the same settings every time you shoot. If you're shooting on a DSLR, you want the ISO setting to be as low as you can get it without underexposing your shot. One very common mistake when shooting in front of a green screen is to stand right in front of the background. This is a bad idea for two reasons. For one, all that bright light bouncing off your screen may spill onto you. And two, you run the risk of casting shadows on your screen no matter how soft your lights are. To avoid another gateway to post-production hell, step away from the screen. 4 or 5 steps forward is all it takes. While you're moving things around, it's a good idea to move the camera back a few steps too, and then zoom in to frame your subject. If your space is limited, well, do the best you can. We recommend that you use at least one dedicated light for the screen itself. Like the lights in front, they should be nice and soft. One common trick is to use a vanity light. Keep it nice and low out of the shot, and find a means of keeping the light off of your subject. A bit of tagboard should work. Oh, and make sure you know what you're doing when you wire it up. So now we've done all those things, but the edge is still looking funky and weird and green. The answer to this might just be to fix it in post. The best keyer we've used is called Keylight, and it's included as part of Adobe After Effects. If your keys look hopelessly blocky or noisy, you might want to take Keylight for a spin. It has all the controls you could ever hope for. But we found that you don't need to fiddle with them very much. Once you get a good sample of the key color and adjust the clip black and clip white parameters, you're usually good to go. Keylight is especially good at two things. You know how we mentioned that your green background will spill onto your subject? Well, the spill suppression feature does a really good job at making that go away. It's also especially good at keying semi-transparent things, such as arm hair, head hair, and you know. So just with the steps we've taken so far, we're looking a lot better. In fact, this might even be good enough. But there is one more thing you can do to make your key really shine, and that's to add a hair light. A hair light is common when shooting an interview. It goes above and behind your subject and separates them from the background. By positioning a small spotlight, or even a clip light, above the screen, your subject will instantly look more three-dimensional and less like a cardboard cutout. So there you have it, a beautiful key that your mom will be proud of. It might look a little too cheesy for some backgrounds, but it should be good enough to spice up even the lamest PowerPoint. That's all for now. I will key you later. That was terrible. I'm sorry.